For those of you who want to stay online, I'm going to read this story again. I got this story from Common Lit. It's a website that has stories with questions. I'm not actually using their questions, but the story is called The Devil by Guy de Maupassant. That looks like a French name, 1903. So that's a long time ago, 100 years ago. So this is going to have some old style kind of writing. And there's a little explanation of who the author is. Guy de Maupassant was a French writer famous for his mastery of the short story. His writing often depicts human lives and social forces in pessimistic terms, right? Negative terms. In The Devil, Guy de Maupassant follows the last few days of the dying mother Bontemps and the deal her son makes for her care. As you read, take notes on whatever motivates characters' actions through the story. All right, I'm going to ask you guys to focus on characters. All right, characterization, how authors create characters in this story. Okay, so here we go. The peasant was standing opposite the doctor by the bedside of the dying old woman, and she, calmly resigned and quite lucid, looked at them and listened to their talking. She was going to die, and she did not rebel about it, for her life was over. She was 92. So we have met two characters so far. We have met the peasant and the old woman. The July sun streamed in at the window and through the open door and cast its hot flames on the uneven brown clay floor, which had been stamped down by 4 generations of clodhoppers, big fat boots. The smell of the fields came in, also driven by the brisk wind and parched by the noontide heat. The grasshoppers chirped themselves hoarse, filling the air with their shrill noise, like that of the wooden crickets which are sold to children at fair time. So there's some interesting things going on there. We have a brown clay floor in the room. So apparently these people are poor and they work on a farm. And it's old time, back when people used to buy wooden toy crickets. The doctor raised his voice and said, "Honoré, you cannot leave your mother in this state. She may die at any moment." And the peasant, in great distress, replied, "But I must get in my wheat, for it has been lying on the ground a long time, and the weather is just right for it. What do you say about it, mother?" And the dying woman, still possessed by her Norman avariciousness, replied, "Yes," with her eyes and her forehead, and so urged her son to get in his wheat and leave her to die alone. But the doctor got angry, and stamping his foot, he said, "You are no better than a brute. Do you hear? And I will not allow you to do it. Do you understand? And if you must get in your wheat today, go and fetch Rapet's wife and make her look after your mother. I will have it. And if you do not obey me, I will let you die like a dog when you are ill in your turn. Do you hear me?" Interesting things going on here. For one, we have her portrayed as a Norman, which is like a Viking, and avariciousness, which is like greediness. So she is being portrayed, the old woman, as a greedy Viking, right? Even though it's French, so they must have sailed their ship to France and like settled there. And the other interesting thing about it is this getting in my wheat. All right. Guy's a farmer. And maybe you've heard the expression, make hay while the sun shines. What happens is they cut down the grass and they leave it in the sunshine to dry. And then they scrape it all up and store it. And of course, if it rains on the wheat, that's really bad because it gets wet and then it rots. So you want to get your wheat harvested while the sun is shining. And that's what he's saying. I can't sit in here with mom because the sun is shining. The peasant, a tall, thin fellow with slow movements, who was tormented by indecision, by his fear of the doctor and his keen love of saving, hesitated, calculating, and stammered out, "How much does La Rapette charge for attending sick people?" This is interesting. We've been given a bunch of information about the character the character is kind of described here as tall and thin, slow movements, and indecisive and afraid of the doctor, and he loves saving money, right? So we've been given a direct characterization by the author. The author's told us about the character. How should I know? The doctor cried. That depends on how long she's waited for. Settle it with her, by Jove, which is an old-fashioned god, right? But I want her to be here within an hour. Do you hear? So the man made up his mind. I'll go for her, he replied. Don't get angry, doctor. And the latter left, calling out as he went, take care, for I do not joke when I'm angry. And as soon as they were alone, the peasant turned to his mother, said in a resigned voice, I'll go and fetch La Rapette, as the man will have it. Don't go off while I'm away. And he went out in his turn. La Rapette, who was an old washerwoman, watched the dead and the dying of the neighborhood, and then, as soon as she had sewn her customers into that linen cloth from which they would emerge no more, she went and took up her irons to smooth the linen of the living. Wrinkled like last year's apple, spiteful, envious, avaricious, with a phenomenal avarice, bent double as if she had been broken in half across the loins by the constant movement of the iron over the linen, one might have said that she had a kind of monstrous and cynical affection for a death struggle. She never spoke of anything but of the people she had seen die, of the various kinds of deaths at which she had been present, and she related with greatest minuteness details which were always the same, just like a sportswoman talks of his shots. So we have another description. This description is of the washerwoman, La Rapette. We are told what she looks like, what she acts like, and what she does. And so we can figure out what she's like from the description. When Honoré Bontemps I think means like good time in French, but I'm not entirely sure. When Honoré Bontemps entered her cottage, he found her preparing the starch for the collars of the village woman, and he said, Good evening. I hope you're pretty well, Mother Rapette. She turned her head round to look at him and said, Fairly well, fairly well. And you? Oh, as for me, I am as well as could wish, but my mother is very sick. Your mother? Yes, my mother. What's the matter with her? She's going to turn up her toes. That's what's the matter with her. The old woman took her hands out of the water and asked with sudden sympathy, Oh, is she as bad as all that? The doctor says she will not last till morning. Then certainly she is very bad. Honoré hesitated, for he wanted to make a few preliminary remarks before coming to his proposal, but as he could hit upon nothing, he made up his mind suddenly. How much are you going to ask to stop with her till the end? You know that I'm not rich, and I cannot even afford to keep a servant girl. It's just that which has brought my four mothers to this state, too much work and fatigue. She used to work for 10 in spite of her 92 years. You don't find any made of that stuff nowadays. Okay, so he's asking for how much it'll cost to have somebody keep watch over her, and talks also, interestingly, about what she was like as an old woman. She was a very hard worker. La Rapette answered gravely, There are two prices, 42 sous by day and 3 francs by night for the rich, and 20 sous by day and 40 by night for the others. You shall pay me the 20 and 40. But the peasant reflected, for he knew his mother well. He knew how tenacious of life, how vigorous and unyielding she was. He knew, too, that she might last another week, in spite of the doctor's opinion. And so he said resolutely, No, I would rather you would fix a price until the end. I will take my chance, one way or the other. The doctor says she will die very soon. If that happens, so much the better for you, and so much the worse for me. But if she holds out until tomorrow or longer, so much the better for me, and so much the worse for you. This is interesting that he's making a deal. He thinks that he's going to save money if he makes a deal for her staying as long as it takes for her to die. And the nurse looked at the man in astonishment, for she had never treated a death as a speculative job, and she hesitated, tempted by the idea of the possible gain. But almost immediately she suspected that he wanted to juggle her. I can say nothing until I've seen your mother, she replied. Then come with me and see her. She washed her hands and went with him immediately. They did not speak on the road. She walked with short, hasty steps, while he strode on with his long legs, as if he were crossing a brook at every step. The cows lying down in the fields, overcome by the heat, raised their heads heavily and lowed feebly at the two passers-by, as if to ask them for some green grass. When they got near the house, Honoré Bontemps murmured, "Suppose it's all over?" And the unconscious wish that it might be so showed itself in the sound of his voice. But the old woman was not dead. She was lying on her back, on her wretched bed, her hands covered with a pink cotton counterpane, horribly thin, knotty paws like some strange animal's, or like crab's claws, hands closed by rheumatism, fatigue, and the work of nearly a century which she had accomplished. So we have a description of the old lady and her old-looking hands. La Rapette went up the bed and looked at the dying woman, felt her pulse, tapped on her chest, listened to her breathing, and asked her questions so as to hear her speak. And then, having looked at her for some time longer, she went out of the room, followed by Honoré. His decided opinion was that the old woman would not last out until the night, and he asked, "Well?" And the sick nurse replied, "Well, she may last 2 days, perhaps 3. You will have to give me 6 francs, everything included." 6 francs! 6 francs! He shouted. "Are you out of your mind? I tell you that she cannot last more than 5 or 6 hours." And then they disputed angrily for some time. But as the nurse, she said she would go home as the time was slipping away, and as his wheat would not come to the farmyard of his own accord, he agreed to her terms at last. "Very well, then that's settled. 6 francs, including everything, until the corpse is taken out." That's settled, then. 6 francs. So they make a deal. 6 francs, or dollars, or whatever you want to think of in your mind, to have her stay until the old woman finally dies. I think he thinks that it's a little expensive, but she has looked at the body and decided that that's a good price. And he went away with long strides to his wheat, which was lying on the ground under the hot sun which ripens the grain, while the sick nurse returned to the house. She had brought some work with her, for she worked without stopping by the side of the dead and dying, sometimes for herself, sometimes for the family, who employed her as a seamstress also, paying her rather more in that capacity. And suddenly she asked, "Have you received the last sacrament, Mother Bontemps?" The old pleasant woman said no with her head, and La Rapette, who was very devout, got up quickly. "Good heavens! Is it possible? I will go and fetch the cure." And she rushed off to the parsonage, so quickly that the urchins in the street thought some accident had happened when he saw her trotting off like that. So she is a religious woman, and she asked about whether or not the priest had come to give her the last prayers, and she's surprised, and she runs off to get the priest to do that. The priest came immediately in his surplice. Now, in this particular thing, it shows us a definition for these words that we might not know. A surplice is a religious garment of loose white linen worn by some prominent leaders of the Christian church. Okay, I didn't know that. Okay, the priest came immediately in his surplice, preceded by a choir boy who rang a bell to announce the passage of the host, which I think is the bread, through the parched and quiet country. Some men working at a distance took off their large hats and remained motionless until the white vestment had disappeared from some farm buildings, his white clothing. And the women who were making up the sheaves stood up to make the sign of the cross. And the sheaves is where they pile up the wheat into stacks, and you've seen it in decorations. They pile up the wheat to let it dry so it doesn't dry on the ground. The frightened black hens ran away along the ditch until they reached a well-known hole through which they suddenly disappeared, while a foal, which was tied up in a meadow, took fright at the sight of the surplice and began to gallop around at the length of its rope, kicking violently. The choir boy, in his red cassock, another type of clothing, walked quickly, and the priest, the square biretta on his bowed head, followed him, muttering some prayers. Last of all came La Rapette, bent almost double, as if she wished to prostrate herself. She walked with folded hands, as if she were in church. Honore saw them pass in the distance, and he asked, "Where's our priest going to?" And his man, who was more acute, replied, "He's taking the last sacrament to your mother, of course." The peasant was not surprised, and he said, "That's quite possible," and went on with his work. Mother Bontemps confessed, received absolution and extreme unction, and the priest took his departure, leaving the two women alone in the suffocating cottage. La Rapette began looking at the dying woman and to ask herself whether it could last much longer. So she was given the last rites of her religion, where she confessed and was forgiven. The day was on the wane, which means it was fading, and a cooler air came in stronger puffs, making a view of Epinal, which was fastened to the wall by two pins, flap up and down. So apparently there was a picture on the wall. The scanty window curtains, which had formerly been white but were now yellow and covered with fly specks, looks as if they were going to fly off the wall and seemed to struggle to get away, like the old woman's soul. Okay, so she's dying. They're waiting for her to die. She's had her last rites. Woman's going to get paid 6 francs to watch her the whole time. Lying motionless with her eyes open, the old mother seemed to await the death which was so near and which yet delayed its coming with perfect indifference. Her short breath whistled in her throat. It would stop altogether soon, and there would be one woman less in the world, one whom nobody would regret. At nightfall, Honoré returned, and when he went up to the bed and saw that his mother was still alive, he asked, "How is she?" just as he had done formerly, when she had been sick. And then he sent La Rapette away, saying to her, "Tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock, without fail." And she replied, "Tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock." And if you were a farmer, you would, of course, start working at 5 o'clock because the sun would come up, and you need to take advantage of the sun. She came at daybreak and found Honoré eating his soup, which he had made himself before going to work. "Well, is your mother dead?" asked the nurse. "She's rather better now, on the contrary," he replied, with a malignant look out of the corner of his eyes, and then he went out. Now, why would he have an evil look coming out of his eyes? Is it because he thinks that he is going to make some kind of a deal? He's gonna get more for his money by making the woman stay? La Prayette was seized with anxiety and went up to the dying woman, who was in the same state, lethargic and impassive, her eyes open and her hands clutching at the counterpane. The nurse perceived that this might go on thus for 2 days, 4 days, 8 days even, and her avaricious mind was seized with fear. She was excited to fury against the cunning fellow who had tricked her and against the woman who would not die. So apparently, Miss La Rapette is also thinking about whether or not she's going to make money. She's going to get paid 6 francs, but maybe she'll have to be there for more days. Nevertheless, she began to sew and waited with her eyes fixed on the wrinkled face of Mother Bontemps. When Honoré returned to breakfast, he seemed quite satisfied and even in a bantering humor, for he was carrying in his wheat under very favorable circumstances. La Rapette was getting exasperated. Every passing minute now seemed to her so much time and money stolen from her. She felt a mad inclination to choke this old ass, this headstrong old fool, this obstinate old wretch, to stop that short, rapid breath which was robbing her of time and money by squeezing her throat a little. But then she reflected on the danger of doing so, and the other thoughts came into her head, so she went up to her bed and said to her, "Have you ever seen the devil?" So La Rapette is now actually thinking of killing her, choking her, but instead she tells her a story. Mother Bontemps whispered, "No," and then the sick nurse began to talk and to tell her tales, likely to terrify her weak and dying mind. "Some minutes before one dies, the devil appears," she said, "to all. He has a broom in his hand and a saucepan on his head, and he utters loud cries. When anybody has seen him, all was over, and that person had only a few moments longer to live." And then she enumerated all to those whom the devil had appeared that year: Josephine Lucelle, Eulalia Radier, Sophia Paganel, Seraphine Grosbead. Oh, so she describes that the devil comes to these people, all right? And interesting, she actually describes what he looks like, which I've never heard before, that he has a saucepan on his head. I wonder why she describes him like that. Mother Bontemps, who was at last most disturbed in the mind, moved about, wrung her hands, and tried to turn her head to look out the other end of the room. And suddenly, La Paillette disappeared at the foot of the bed. She took a sheet out of the cupboard and wrapped herself up in it. And then she put the iron pot onto her head so that its 3 short bent feet rose up like horns, took a broom in her right hand and a tin pail in her left, which she threw up suddenly so that it might fall on the ground noisily. That's interesting. So there was a saucepan right there. And that's why she described the devil like this, is because she saw that she could put a saucepan on her head and dress up just like the devil. What is she doing? And then she made a really noisy sound. And certainly when it came down, it made a terrible noise. And then climbing onto a chair, the nurse showed herself gesticulating and uttering shrill cries into the pot, which covered her face, while she menaced the old woman, who was nearly dead, with her broom. Terrified, with a mad look on her face, the dying woman made a superhuman effort to get up and escape. She even got to her shoulders and chest out of bed, and then she fell back with a deep sigh. All was over. Dun, dun, dun. And La Rapayette calmly put everything back into its place, the broom into the corner by the cupboard, the sheet inside it, the pot onto the hearth, the pail onto the floor, and the chair against the wall. And then, with a professional air, she closed the dead woman's enormous eyes, put a plate on the bed, and poured some holy water into it, and dipped the twig of boxwood into it. Kneeling down, she fervently repeated the prayers for the dead, which she knew by heart as a matter of business. So what has she just done? She had just terrified the old woman, and she actually like caused her to die from fright. And when Honoré returned in the evening, he found her praying. He calculated immediately that she had made 20 sous out of him, for she had only spent 3 days and 1 night there, which made 5 francs altogether instead of the 6 which he owed her. Interesting. So instead of worrying about his mother being dead, he's worried about the fact that he feels like he's been cheated out of a day's pay because he paid the woman more. Apparently the woman was thinking the same thing, and she figured out a way to shorten the time. Dun, dun, dun. That's the story. I will post questions for you. The questions will be on the characters, what they're like and how they're developed, how they're described by the author, also how their actions and their words make you think about them, what you think about the characters.